Welcome to the stories of the night. It was a chilly spring day on the afternoon of March 31st, 1922. 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel was getting her 7-year-old daughter Kazelia and her 2-year-old son Joseph ready for supper. Her father, 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, stood in the kitchen while watching Kazelia, his 72-year-old wife, cook the food. As Andreas watched his wife, she stared back at him and saw the worried look in his eyes. Andreas smiled at her, despite the unease that sat within the back of his mind. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel happy watching the scene unfold, with the exception of feeling upset for Victoria. Ever since the loss of her husband, Victoria has been doing everything she can to stay above water for her children. All he wants is for her to understand that they all want her to be happy and especially okay. As Andreas was admiring his lovely family, he heard a knock at the door. Andreas opened the door and was greeted by their new maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner. She had finally arrived after a lengthy trip to the Brugger home for her new job as the household maid. He welcomed her inside, and after helping Maria become adjusted, Andreas felt a bit more optimistic about life within the Brugger home. As the morning of April 1st rolled around, the school day was supposed to begin for little Kazelia. Only her teacher noticed that Kazelia was absent from school that morning. They thought it was strange, as Kazelia was never one to miss school like that. It was especially odd that no one had been notified of the reason for her absence either. Several days went by, and neighbors of the Bruggers had begun to become increasingly worried. No one had seen little Kazelia go to school, and it seemed that no one had seen any other members of the family since March 31st. Some of the neighbors decided to do a welfare check at the Brugger home at around 9 a.m. on April 4th, 1922. What they discovered wouldn't just shock the region surrounding Hinterkaifeck, but also haunt the citizens of the once quiet and bustling village for generations to come. Andreas Gruber was born on November 9th, 1858, in the Bavarian locality of Greinstetten. In 1886, he married Kazelia Gruber, formerly Sandhuter, and subsequently moved to Hinterkaifeck. Property ownership was given to Kazelia as part of a divorce settlement with their previous husband, Josef Assam. Victoria's late husband, Carl Gabriel, of whom she married and had produced their daughter Kazelia Gabriel, was conscripted in World War I and was believed to have been killed in the Battle of Arras on December 12, 1914. In 1915, Andreas and Victoria were convicted of having an incestuous affair that took place between 1907 and 1910. Andreas ended up in prison for 1 year, while Victoria only served a 1-month prison sentence. Then, in 1919, Andreas was once again accused of having an incestuous relationship with Victoria after she went and confessed to her lover, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. She also confessed to Lorenz that her newborn son, Joseph Gabriel, was conceived through her father after the continuation of the abuse. Despite credible evidence, Lorenz decided to withdraw his complaint after Andreas was arrested once again, yet decided to reassert his claims while giving sworn testimony at his trial. This trial concluded with the court finding Lorenz's testimony to be insufficient for a conviction, allowing Andreas to be released without being given compensation for his pretrial detention. Schlittenbauer would end up adopting Joseph Gabriel as his own son. Lorenz Schlittenbauer had discovered the bodies along with the other villagers. Andreas, Kazelia, Victoria, and her daughter were all stacked neatly inside the barn on the Brugger property. Meanwhile, inside the house, little Joseph was found killed in his crib, and Maria Baumgartner was found murdered in her bedroom. The Brugger family and Maria had all suffered blows to the head by a mattock, which is a tool similar to a pickaxe. This mattock would later be recovered in the attic of the house. Later that afternoon, Inspector Jörg Reingruber, who worked for the Munich Police Department, had finally arrived at the Brugger property after receiving word of a brutal massacre that had taken place in Hinterkaifeck. One of the first things he noticed as he examined the grisly scene was this. Someone had fed the cattle after the murders, and not only that, but whoever committed the acts had also eaten food from the kitchen during the days after the murders. The perpetrator or perpetrators remained at the scene for days following the crime. They slept in the beds, prepared meals in the kitchen, and tended to the livestock as if they belonged there. Weinberger stated in his initial report the following day on April 5th, 1922. It was also noted that the fireplace had been used in the 3 days following the massacre. When questioning the neighbors, they had told police that Andreas had been noticing some strange occurrences happening on the Brugger property in the months, even days, leading up to the demise of the family. Crescens Rieger, the original family maid, had reportedly quit 6 months prior to the massacre due to claiming to hear strange noises in the attic, believing it to be haunted. In March 1922, Andreas had found a newspaper that did not belong to him and believed that the postman had forgotten it. However, this was not the case, as no one in the vicinity subscribed to that particular newspaper. In the days leading up to the massacre, Andreas had noticed that footsteps were present in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest to a door where the lock was broken. This door led to the farm's machine room. Despite the family hearing footsteps in the attic the very night of the murders, the investigation into the noise produced no results, and ended up refusing any and all help presented to him by his neighbors. Unfortunately, he also refused to go to the police with these concerns that had been persisting in the months leading up to March 31st. One of many questions popped up immediately following this revelation. Why did Andreas Brugger decide not to call the authorities? Despite hearing and seeing strange things happening throughout his property, one would imagine a frightened homeowner calling the police in this instance. However, it was more than likely that Andreas chalked it up to be paranoia, or he was too prideful to admit his unease. Either way, that decision would prove fatal to Andreas and his family. As the autopsies were finalized on April 6, 1922, Dr. Johann Baptist Müller said this in his report, with the final part being the most disturbing from the post-mortem examination. The family had been murdered between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. on Friday, March 31st. The cause of death for all 6 victims was trauma to the skull, likely from the same farm tool used during the attack. Casilia had chunks of her hair torn out while lying in the barn for hours after the attack, indicating she had survived the initial blow, only to die slowly beside her slain family members. Lorenz, who was mentioned previously, had come under brief suspicion following the Brugger family massacre. It was noted by other villagers that at approximately 10:30 a.m. during the discovery of the massacre, Lorenz had separated from the party in order to enter the house alone entirely. He claimed later on that, "I wanted to check on little Joseph." While he was familiar with the farmhouse, investigators found this to be quite suspicious. This was especially since it was known locally that Victoria and Lorenz had an affair, though this lead would be ruled out eventually by the authorities. Over 100 suspects, including the likes of Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Karl Gabriel, Peter Weber, and Paul Müller, were questioned and interrogated throughout the investigation. However, not a single one was charged with the massacre of the Brugger family and Maria. No true motive was established in relation to the crime as well, besides the police suspecting robbery as a prime motive. And by October of 1922, investigators found themselves at a dead end due to having no confessions or proper conclusion, therefore having the case end up becoming a cold one. Despite repeated arrests over the years, no murderer was ever found, and the case ended up coming to a close officially in 1955. In 1986, Detective Chief Superintendent Konrad Müller-Thumann had one last set of interrogations take place before retiring from the Munich Police Department. Emanuel Bogarts, a local pastor in Hinterkaifeck, had written in his journal on the one-year anniversary of the Hinterkaifeck Murders. It reads as follows: "The shadow of Hinterkaifeck hangs over this community like a shroud. The children have nightmares. The adults lock their doors. No one walks alone after dark." The farmhouse and barn where the massacre took place ended up being demolished sometime in 1923, with the site being untouched and empty to this day. In what seems to be an active good deed by fate, some good news would come about in 2007. Students who attended the police academy in Fürst and Fulbrook decided to re-examine the Hinterkaifeck case using modern criminal investigation techniques. On November 11th, they released their conclusions on what they found. They came to an agreement on who the killer was, however, would not release the name out of respect for the perpetrator's descendants, who were still around in the area. It was also noted that, due to the mistreatment of evidence and the amount of time that had elapsed, it was impossible to truly solve the crime. On top of that, the students also made it clear that the lack of professional forensics, despite meticulous police work, helped them come to their conclusion. While it's good that they came to an agreement on who the killer was, perhaps it truly is best that we don't know who massacred the Brugger family. The citizens of Hinterkaifeck suffered many generations living in fear because of the sheer brutality of the massacre. It's a grim reminder that evil can enter our home, no matter how much we want to push forward the ignorant idea that it will never happen to me. Evil knows no bounds, and sometimes evil breaks into your home, leaving nothing but questions and speculation that lasts long after you have been laid to rest.